is the Girl Chat International podcast. Welcome to the Girl Chat International podcast, where we talk about modern day topics and aim to cultivate a safe and empowered community across the globe. I'm Aubrey, and this is my co-host,
Hersyn. Welcome back.
So we'll just first, before we dive in, we're really excited for this episode. We have a really special guest who will intro soon, and we know you're all in for a treat. But before we do that, we have our empowered questions. So, what do your family and friends like about you?
Let me ask you, because you're my friend.
I would say sense of humor, go-getter, determination, kind heart, generosity. Aww. I would say those are probably the core that people bring up. Someone who's into her faith. Mm-hmm. So you actually have something that you're living for. So that's always something that people want in a friend.
Yeah, I think that's what my family would say as well, and my friends. So that's my answer.
Good. Okay, I'll put it on you. What would you say about me?
I think, you try your best to understand someone, and you're very empathetic. And because you're a therapist, so you really validate someone. You make them feel seen and heard. So I really appreciate you. I really appreciate that about you so much, because like amongst my friend, you really make me feel very validated. So thank you. And you're also, whatever you said about me, you're determined, you're a go-getter, you're kind, you have great sense of humor, we laugh a lot. So that's what I would say about you. There's a long list, but these are the prominent ones.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. Thank you so much. And welcome. I would say family would agree. I mean, they always say that I'm the most empathetic in the fam and the nicest one in the family.
The nicest.
Yeah, I'm probably the most soft and fluffy one in the family, which is hilarious.
Soft and fluffy. I love that.
Yep. Awesome. So to our listeners, you just learned a little bit more about us. If you're new here, welcome. We're excited to have you. And if you've been a long time listener, thank you for staying on. And I think you're really going to love this episode. So here we go.
Today, we have our very special guest. It's an honor to have you here, Tracy Vadakumchery, or the Bad Indian Therapist. She's a LMHC, LPCC, and she's a licensed Indian American therapist in New York who calls herself the Bad Indian Therapist. She helps South Asian Americans address cultural guilt, shame, trauma, and related stress as they affect their relationships with family, friends, partners, and sense of self. She's currently accepting new clients in New York, California, and Florida. Visit her Instagram and TikTok at The Bad Indian Therapist to book your free intro call and sign up for her newsletter today. So thank you very much, Tracy, for coming on the Girl Chat International podcast. It's an honor to finally, have you here.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here too. Thank you for reaching out.
All right. Shall we get right into it? So what led you to start the Bad Indian Therapist? I really admire you. You're so badass. So tell us the story.
I came up with the Bad Indian Therapist actually around this time last year. It's been something that's kind of looming in my head, but I wasn't quite sure if people would accept it, which I guess doesn't matter when you call yourself the Bad Indian Therapist. But the idea is that there's no such thing as being a good Indian. And a lot of what we've thought makes us a good Indian, or like doing things for the culture, actually doesn't make you good, right? A lot of the ways that we've been conditioned to be good or nice
Mm-hmm.
actually is just people pleasing, it's just placating, it's just like obedience that prevents us from really standing up for ourselves. And I'm basically here to say there's no such thing as a good or a bad Indian, just being a more genuine one and just being your more authentic self. Like no one has it down perfectly, and some of these things that make us good aren't actually accurate to the culture. So that's why I call myself the bad Indian therapist. It's to normalize that it's okay to not be like this perfect Indian kid or this perfect
Yeah.
Indian girl. Like it's okay to veer off track and
Mm-hmm.
make yourself known.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, yeah, it's true. It's like as a Desi girl, we've grown up with the good girl conditioning. You got to be good, you got to please people, get
Right.
good grades. And yeah, so when I discovered you on Instagram, I was like, wow, like I need to follow her. You are someone that we all have wanted to become, like the bad, to be called bad, the bad, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
And to see someone out there like that really gives all of us inspiration. And I really love all your posts on Instagram.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sorry for the background noise.
Okay, my
Yeah.
son's over here barking too, so yeah.
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 Yeah. Aubrey, do you have anything to add?
Actually, the next question goes really well with that. Because as you were talking and you were saying, yeah, well, being good or bad doesn't even go with the ideology. And that made me right away think about shame and guilt. So I want to move us to that next question of how can women tackle guilt and shame, specifically women of color?
So I actually wrote a blog post that goes into this a little bit more this week, specifically for Indian American women. Although this can apply to like women of the South Asian diaspora or South Asian women who don't necessarily live in the West, or just like women of color in general. I like to call it the perfect Indian girl syndrome. And I put a little trademark right next to it because it is something that is like formulated and um pretty like it's like a recipe almost. It's like you put your stamp on it and like you're just like this trademark Indian girl. And perfect Indian girl syndrome, it's not a real diagnosis, but it's something that I've noticed, my clinical observations as a therapist with a lot of South Asian women that I see in my practice, is that there is like this very formulaic way to be. And if you break out of that norm, you should feel bad. In fact, you might even feel like you're doing something wrong. If you're not getting the right education, getting the right career, getting the right job,
Mm-hmm.
getting the right body, getting the right skin tone, getting the right husband, having the right marriage. Like if you're not,
Preach.
yes, if you're not doing everything right, you should feel bad if you veer off track, right? And that is what I like to call toxic guilt, toxic shame.
Mhm.
Toxic guilt is about like this idea that you are doing something wrong if you're not doing that. And toxic shame is I am bad. Something's wrong with me because I'm not doing what every other Indian girl is doing. So I'm bad, right? We make our actions our identity. And in order for women of color in general to get a good idea of, okay, this is toxic guilt, this is toxic shame, this is I use toxic because I know it's like the most popular term in the world right now. What I really mean is unhealthy, conditioned, right? Conditioned guilt, conditioned shame. In order for women of color to recognize that this is conditioned guilt, this is conditioned shame, not healthy, is to recognize your values. What are your values? And that's such a vague thing. I realize like values is like, okay, what the hell does that mean? But In acceptance and commitment therapy, there's this thing called the values checklist. And they give you very specific words. Values are usually, they can be summed up in about 1 to 3 words. It's not like a full-on sentence. A value is just something that you try to live your life by. So a good one is altruism, right? Altruism, that's one word. You can sum up a value in one word. Altruism, which is the ability to do good for others, right? If you are a woman of color and you value altruism, ask yourself, how do you live according to your values? Not according to the values of other people, right? Someone else may value being family oriented. That may not be your value, right? So recognizing how you're living according to your values. And if you're listening to this, I highly recommend checking out, it's called the ACT Values Checklist. Should be available, like if you just Google it, but that's just a good idea of values that you can identify with. Not the values that other people expect you to uphold, but your values. And just identify, what are the steps that I'm taking to uphold these values? What am I doing? What are the actions that I'm doing to uphold my values? So to answer your question, the imperfect way to like really address toxic guilt and toxic shame is to identify what your values are and then how you're living according to those values.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea of having people look at the checklist and fill this out based on them, not their family, society, the culture, whatever it is. That's great. So if you're listening, do that today.
It's so hard, I find, I think for women of color especially, because we are seen, like, women are the symbols of a culture. And we see this in the media with like beauty pageants, Miss World, Miss Universe. Like, male beauty pageants are starting to grow, but they're not as popular as women because we are expected to uphold the traditions of a culture, from the way we cook to the way we dance. And former President Barack Obama even once said that you can assess how developed a country is based on the way that they treat its women and children. This is how we evaluate cultures, is through how women uphold traditions, how women are treated. And I often find that for a lot of Black and brown women or BIPOC women, it is very hard to recognize your own unique and individual needs when you've been conditioned to care so much about your community. And because there are moments where you do have to care a lot about your community, especially right now with everything going on in Gaza, like that is when your guilt is really triggered. That intergenerational trauma of your guilt is really triggered. And that's you living according to your values, right? You value your community, you're going to stand up for your community. Sometimes because of that, we don't know the difference between like, when is my guilt actually healthy versus when it's conditioned by what people expect me to do.
Absolutely. I've been chatting with a lot of students and they've been saying to me, I have guilt. There's a lot of guilt because of seeing what's going on out there. But look at me. And these are American people and people of color. I'm here and I just feel guilty. And it just brings up other things, from other areas of their life. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Right. And
yeah,
I wanted to add that, like, when I talk about toxic guilt and toxic shame, I'm not implying that all guilt is bad or that all guilt or all shame is bad. There's no such thing as good and bad emotions. It's just the way that we react to our emotions that can be bad, the way that we respond to our emotions that can be bad. So when I have clients who come to me and say, I've been feeling so guilty for living a comfortable life this past month while there's a genocide happening, I tell them, like, you know what, that guilt is a normal response to like, not all guilt is bad. Like, that's actually a good thing. And I think right now it's really important to get our clients to understand the difference between the guilt that they feel that is good versus like when other moments in their life, other parts in their life, when they act on their guilt in a not so healthy way. Right now, acting on your guilt is a good thing.
Right. Yeah, it shows you're a human with a heart.
Right. Absolutely. I
Yeah.
wish more people had that.
Mm-hmm.
Our
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
lives easier.
Agreed.
Actually, I have a question for you, Aubrey. So, like, as brown woman, we have a lot of guilt, right? Like, you have to be academically smart and then either be a doctor, lawyer, or therapist and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Doctor, lawyer, engineer, and all that. So, like, we have a lot of conditioning in our lives. So, like, how about, growing up in your family, being a Black woman? Like, do y'all have such conditionings as well? Maybe you
It's
can share a bit.
for millennial women and probably beyond. It's interesting because everyone was told go to college and just get whatever degree you can and try to get as many degrees as you can, because for such a long time in America, Black people in general weren't even allowed. I mean, people of color were not allowed in universities. So a lot of my family do not have degrees. I mean, I'm a first generation college student.
Mhm.
So there was a pressure of go do it, but then there's no direction of how to do it. And I see that with a lot of students I work with today. They're kind of like, here I am, but this is really scary because when you're a first generation college student, there's certain things that you're not learning in your household that maybe a lot of the white folks are learning as they're raised and brought up, and there's certain vocabulary. I remember being an undergrad and hearing words and not knowing what the heck the professor just said, so I'm just writing it down and Googling it later. And there's just a lot of other things to navigate in general. So yeah, there's pressure to be great, but then no direction. So you kind of, I see it go 50-50. There's people like myself and a lot of my friends who just kind of overcompensated, were overachievers, would get really stressed if things weren't going exactly to plan. And then there's others that pause and freeze and can't finish because that's how lacking in resources everything is. So I think I kind of answered your question, but I would say it's really similar though to everything else. I mean, there's this expectation to be like a rock of the
Okay,
family, to take
let's
care
talk
of
about
everyone.
marriage. Do y'all have the conditioning? Like, you got to get married at this age, and,
Mm-hmm.
like, what about
Uh,
that? Like, the relationship part of life.
I would say the relationships, it depends on the people's background, honestly.
Mm,
Because some of my friends who might have a Nigerian background or like a Haitian background, there's a little bit more of a pressure, but then more of the like African Americans, it's kind of like, get married to someone that you could see it working in
wow.
because of the
Mm,
struggles, but it's because everyone's learning from the struggles. There's generations upon generations of single mother households,
yeah.
and so it's finally at that place of do it when it's right. But meanwhile, Hersyn, I know that you've shared with me, on the flip side, it
Mm,
looks very different. Like, for example, I have friends, South Asian friends, who they've
mm,
said to me they have like uncles over in India sending them emails of list of men that they can reach out to and their data, and trying to say, hey, it's time to get married, you're 30 years old, are you okay? So I know there's
yeah.
a shift. I mean, there's differences there, I would say the biggest
Mm-hmm.
difference.
I mean, I'm grateful that my parents do not push me to like get married and all, because like I think, because I know most brown people in America, like y'all are first generations there, like first generation American, but in Malaysia, my grandparents and parents are Malaysians. So
Mhm.
like, we've adapted to the lifestyle here, and if you're here, like progressive a little bit, you know. It's like they do not pressure you, and my parents are like looking at the boy. Like, so my parents do not push me to get married, and I'm very open, maybe because I'm an only child. So like my parents are like my best friends. So I tell them everything, and they're like, after what you've been through, and you know, all the boys this generation, like, just, you know, focus on yourself and build your platform, build your empire, be a scientist. And yeah, so, but I mean, we see that a lot still here, where not even 30, Aubrey, it's like you hit 25 and that's when they're like, it's time to find you a good boy, you know, a good boy. So yeah, which
So, actually, just to make a connection there, that makes sense because, like you said, you have generations of parents and grandparents considered Malaysians. And then what I was just sharing with both sides of my family, the one side, they came in as immigrants, the other side were forced to come here, but we have generations upon generations of us. So of course they've been able to settle and establish. So I imagine that those of cultures where they are that first generation American born here, or some of my friends came here from India and they got their citizenship, so it looks like that. So I could see why parents could be really, oh my gosh, we need to, you know, hold down our roots here and, you know, make a name for ourselves. So that's making sense to me as you say that.
You know, there's actually a phenomenon going on where Indian Americans are kind of realizing just how much more progressive the younger generations of people in India are, and just general Asian hemisphere. And to me, it's shocking to see like really progressive people in India, like very progressive, like very open-minded. And it's shocking to me because even for like Indian Americans in the US, born and raised in the US, Gen Z, they can be really homophobic, really transphobic, really racist. Like, it's insane. And it's like, why is there such a discrepancy between Indian American youth in the US and then Indian youth in the South Asian hemisphere? And it's because our parents, when they left India and migrated to the US in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they took with them the values and the attitudes of their time to the United States. And coming off of post-colonial India, they understood that when they come to the US, they have to assimilate. And assimilation means they have to also assimilate to whiteness in order to survive. So not only have they inherited a lot of the cultural attitudes and beliefs of India in the 60s, 70s, and 80s about women and marriage, but that they've also taken on a lot of the beliefs of racism, essentially, in order to be like respectable, like model minorities here. Whereas India has, I mean, India still has its problems, but it's changed so much.
Yeah, I'm shocked, you know, looking at like all these Bollywood stars, and like nowadays, like all the dramas that you see on all the series on Netflix, like they are so open, you know, they talk about LGBTQ and and then for them to live in and all, I'm like, wow, you know, progression.
Right.
Yeah, compared to, I mean, even in Malaysia, like some brown people are not that progressive. So you know what I mean? Yeah.
And it's that same thing. They came over at a more conservative time in Indian culture. Interesting. Those parallels are cool to see between US and Malaysia, actually.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, so now the third question, which I think, you know, everyone, I mean, we are also recovering people pleasers. So what steps should people take, you know, to break the cycle of people pleasing? In a way, also like for brown girls to, you know, stop people pleasing their parents, and so as a therapist, what's your advice?
So this is gonna seem like very generic, but I just want to say that breaking out of people pleasing it takes a certain skill set. It takes certain guidance, and it's going to take somebody to have to mirror to you to see when you're people pleasing and when you're not. And in order for you to gain that kind of insight, you got to go to therapy first. Like,
Yes.
you have to go to therapy first. This is not something that you can recognize on your own. I try to put as much information out there on social media as possible, but truthfully, people pleasing is on a case by case basis. So what is people pleasing for one person may look very different from people pleasing for another person. And that's because, you know, we were all, even if we were raised in similar cultural households, we were all raised differently. You may not see what goes on behind closed doors unless you're working with a therapist. You know, a therapist will get you to see your blind spots. I think that sometimes as people, we have a tendency to assume that we know what goes on in somebody else's house. Like, oh, well, my parents never did that to me. My parents would never do that. So the fact that you don't have a relationship with your parents, like, how could you do that to your parents? How could you like abandon your parents like that? You should respect your mom. You don't know what their parents were like. You don't. Just because you guys were raised in similar cultural households does not mean that their parents were good. I'm glad that you had good parents, but that does not mean that their parents were good, right?
Yep.
And because we have a tendency to assume that we know what goes on in other people's houses, what works for you is not going to work for someone else. Like,
Yeah.
the advice, the suggestions that are given to you to work on your people pleasing, it's not going to apply to someone else. You know, I'm trying to, I think the first step is breaking down that black and white thinking when it comes to mental health and relationships and just any kind of advice in general. Just because it works for you does not mean it's going to work for somebody else. And just because it works for somebody else does not mean it's going to work for you. I think that's the first step to recognizing people pleasing, because that's when you realize, oh, I'm following advice that somebody else wants for me. Advice is values driven. It's values driven, right? The advice that somebody gives you, that's what worked for them. It may not work for you. So when you recognize that I'm actually following advice that's meant for somebody else, that's the first step in breaking away from people pleasing, is recognizing when you have to do what works for you and not necessarily what worked for somebody else. I think that the other way to kind of recognize people pleasing is when you're saying or doing things to kind of keep the peace, to kind of avoid conflict. You know, you don't want to ruffle feathers, but that's actually keeping you silent. That's preventing you from actually saying what you feel and what you mean, right? Breaking out of people pleasing is not just setting boundaries. It's also recognizing when you're being nice to keep the peace, to not ruffle feathers, right? Staying out of trouble. That's another thing that you have to recognize, is when you're doing that. Doesn't mean that you have to be mean, doesn't mean that you have to be rude. There's a difference between being kind, having compassion for others and still sticking up for yourself, versus being nice, which is placating. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes 100% sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I actually our go.
No, I mean, I said the same thing like on our previous episode. Like, there's a difference between being kind and, you know, you can be kind but cordial, you know. You can be kind and also say whatever you need to say. So like everything you said makes perfect sense. I was like, yes, tell them. But yeah, Aubrey.
Yeah. Sorry. Sometimes I interrupt because I don't know when's the right time to speak.
It's okay.
Zoom.
It's a girl chat. So
yeah, go ahead.
I think, Hersyn, kind of what you're saying too, right? Like, is that people don't know that you can still be kind and say what you want to say. Like, people think that in order to be nice, you have to say what people want you to say, or you have to keep quiet, that you can't say what you mean, that in order to be nice, you have to give in to what people want. That's not true. That's not how you how you become an empathic person. And I say this because as therapists who started out in this profession, we had to learn very quickly how to set boundaries in a way that's empathic and professional. Like we had to learn that very quickly. Like as therapists, there are going to be administrators, nonprofit managers, employers, just anyone and everyone who are going to take advantage of therapists and their kindness. And as therapists, we know that in order for us to keep doing this work, especially in America where there is a therapist shortage, in order for us to keep doing this work, we have to very kindly say no. Right? And that does not mean you're being mean. It does not mean you're being rude. You're just very empathically saying, "No, I can't do this."
Right.
And that's not being rude, right? I think so many of us, we think that being nice means we have to say what people want to hear. We have to we have to do what people want from me. That's called being nice. That's called being kind and caring. No, being a kind and caring person is saying what you mean with the right tone, with the right words, using your words in a way to communicate understanding and connection. And then if the other person is still putting pressure on you or won't take no for an answer, then you get to be rude, because at that point you've given them the grace of connecting with them and telling them, no, I can't, and here's why. You've given them the gift of explaining that you can't always do everything that they want you to do. And you're saying that because you want to connect with them. You want them to understand.
Right.
And at some point, you have to understand that they refuse to understand. They just want what they want from you. They're trying to take advantage of you, and they're mad that they're not getting what they want from you. At that point, you get to be rude.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between being nice and being kind. And that you can still
love
be a caring person. Yeah.
I think it also goes back to being a brown girl, you know, your parents have always told you, you got to be nice to people, you know, you got to be polite, like, got to, you know, the good girl conditioning, like we've all talked about before. So I think it also goes back to that, because, you know, you've been taught your whole childhood that you got to be nice to people. You can't say no, you got to please everyone, say namaste to all your relatives. So listen to that, people. You gotta be nice, but it's also important to be cordial and rude if you need to be, right?
Right.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Aubrey?
So actually I'm going to have a skip to question 5, and then we'll go.
Okay.
Well, our last question will be the other one, because this kind of goes together. So one of my research areas is racial trauma. And, you know, obviously that's seen a lot in the counseling space when people are going to seek therapeutic services. And I wanted to pick a part of it that kind of went with what we were even talking about today. And something that first came to my mind with racial trauma, what people don't even realize is that it is these experiences of microaggressions or even micro assaults, they actually elicit a trauma response, and people don't always recognize that or believe that it's that serious, probably because of some of this good girl conditioning and whatnot. And when I think about that, a lot of people, they freeze. That's their reaction. Yeah, go ahead.
I will say that there are therapists who don't recognize that either, which is a problem. I've personally interacted with therapists who are like, "Oh, trauma is only PTSD," and have trashed the book "The Body Keeps the Score." And this past month, they've been very silent. So I think that says everything you need to know.
I agree. I 100% agree with what you're saying. It's always so disheartening when other therapists deny this concept. And I'm thinking about there's flight, freeze, and fawn. And kind of what we've been focusing on is more the fawn. So be the good girl, achieve, get the good grades, be really nice to everybody, you know, or freeze, where you hear the thing that to your face or behind your back or on the news and the media, and you just kind of freeze and maybe feel a little depressed. And then I think of this, what you were saying before, model minority. And it made me think a little bit of fawn, because this concept of model minority really pushes South Asians and other like Eastern Asians to just go, work really hard, stick their neck out and help others.
Be the good worker bee. Be the
Yeah.
guy. Yeah.
Exactly. But then also feel really invisible and really only seen as the person that's compliant, but nobody's ever really checking in or caring. It's kind of this being invisible. So I'd love to hear more about, what you see as like racial trauma in clients or in society, and what tips you might even give them.
So when it comes to racial trauma, I think it's important to highlight both the racial trauma experienced from people outside of the cultural group and also the internalized racism of people within the group.
Yep.
I think that both of those are important. And here's why. Because especially with Indian Americans, their idea of what they think it means to be Indian, they don't realize it, but they got it from colonialism, and they got it from racialized stereotypes of Indian people too. They may not realize it, but sometimes they are carrying out a racial trope and they don't see it. They just think, well, this is what it means to be Indian. No, this is what you've heard from your parents and your grandparents who had to survive under colonialism. And then this is what you've seen in the media that is made to be sexy and sell Bollywood. Like, that's not actually what it means to be a quote unquote good Indian. I think that both of these things are important. It's important to recognize the stereotypes that people have of you, and then the expectations that people in your community have of you, because they're both tied together. You're supposed to work hard. You're supposed to be respectable. You're supposed to, be educated, eat right, lose weight, do this, do that. Like, the idea of being perfect or being good, it's actually internalized white supremacy. And there's someone I think that everyone should follow. This is a group by Regina Jackson and Saira Rao, and they run this company. It's called Race to Dinner. And Saira is someone who is second generation Indian American, and she talks about her experience when she realized that she was trying to fulfill this idea of what it means to be a good Indian American girl, not just as the daughter of immigrants, but also to a lot of her white friends. Like, she was trying to strive for perfectionism, and then at some point realized, like, actually this isn't working for me. This is actually really hurting me. And she realized that in the process of trying to be this, good Indian girl, or this good Indian American girl, that she was kind of just allowing her white friends to say some really fucked up about not just people of color, but also about Asians. And she just wanted to be the good, respectable one, the chosen one, right? She just kind of allowed that to happen because she also knew that if she spoke up and said, actually, that's really not okay, they would get mad at her for questioning them, right? And I think that for me, at least, part of helping our clients recognizing racial trauma is also recognizing that they've been conditioned not just within the culture, but also within broader society as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, you said it honestly perfectly. And once again, what comes up for me is people definitely need to go to a BIPOC affirming or a fellow BIPOC therapist to work on this, to have psychoeducation and to freely have these conversations. And of course, so I train future counselors and I do tell them, hey, if you're white, be empathetic and open the space. Start off by saying, hey, I know I'm white and there's certain structural things in our society that, you know, that could make this relationship feel a little scary at times, but I am addressing it right now so that you can be comfortable to share in session and to be yourself and to talk about the hurt. But in general, that's why it's so important for people to go to therapy, because they can really work through this. It's a space where they can do it. But I know, you know, there's stigma, but we're breaking the stigma little by little.
Right. You know, the way that I see the racial trauma play out too, is that I often notice, and this is something that's happened with my clients as well, is that when they have South Asian colleagues or colleagues who share culturally similar ethnicities, there's this expectation that I could just break your boundaries, I could disrespect your time.
Yeah.
And there's this like argument that's being used, which is that like, oh, well, we're culturally similar, you know, we understand, we get it. So we just kind of allow people to disrespect our time because, oh, they're Indian, we're Indian. They'll get it, they'll understand. And I will tell you, I've had my own personal experiences with this, with specifically Instagram pages by Indian people who have very, 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 very large followings, who thought that they were entitled to disrespect my time because, oh, you're Indian, you get it. No, I actually don't get it. Would you ever treat a white colleague this way? No, you wouldn't.
No.
You would never treat a white colleague or a white person in your profession that you're networking with, you would never treat them this way. So what makes you think that I would put up with this because of my ethnicity? It doesn't matter to me that we share the same ethnicity. It doesn't matter to me. The fact that you think, oh, because of my ethnicity, I'd be willing to put up with this, that is internalized racism. You would never treat a white colleague that way. Why do you think I deserve disrespect?
I
Crazy,
love that.
right?
Yeah, it is. I know. And it's disheartening because like you said, that's exactly what's happening. They are taking this racism and just spewing it out unconsciously. And it's like, no, treat others with respect, lift them up. Come on.
That's how they see themselves.
Right.
That's how they see themselves. I've had 3 Instagram pages, large followings led by Indian people who have done this to me. And I have had to be very firm with them. No, I'm not going to work with you. Absolutely not. Because the fact that you think that you can treat me this way shows how you let people treat you. And that's the brand I want to be associated with.
I agree. Wow.
Love that. Boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no amount of someone's following is worth, you know, being treated that way and putting up with that, because then you're associating yourself with that too in the unconscious ways that they share that with their viewers.
They could be buying followers too, you never know. So it's like if you see that 10K followers there, it could be bought.
Right.
So yeah, for you to think someone is of a big following, you know, they could be not. And also, I mean, I'm shocked to hear that in America you have shortage of therapists.
Yeah,
because like to learn, you know, I mean, in Asia we learned about therapy from Hollywood, from, you know, from y'all, from the Western world. So like to hear that in America there's like shortage of therapists, like wow.
So I will say there's a shortage of therapists in private practice. So usually when people think of a therapist, they think of somebody in a private practice setting. that's like the stereotype that comes to mind. When you hear therapist, you think of a professional who works in a private practice or runs a private practice. Most therapists actually do not work in that kind of setting. Most therapists in the US, they work at a community mental health clinic, they work for a nonprofit, they work at a hospital, or they might work at a university, they might work at an agency. And that's because those are the places that have the most stable jobs and guaranteed income, guaranteed benefits for like health, retirement, for the most part. Even honestly, some community mental health agencies don't even offer that. But
Right.
working for somebody else, especially for like an agency or a clinic or an established institution, is actually a lot more of a popular job for a therapist because it's safe. But a private practice therapist, that's an entrepreneurship. That is like a business. You take risks. When you're a private practice therapist, you have to be an entrepreneur. And that means you don't get a stable income. You don't necessarily have a stable salary. Some weeks you see a certain amount of clients and you make good money. And then some weeks, clients cancel or go on vacation, or it's the summer and you don't make as much money. It varies. And you also have to pay for your own like health benefits, retirement benefits. So for a lot of therapists in the US, being a private practice therapist is a risk. That's a financial risk. And that's why a lot of therapists are like, I don't really want to do private practice. I'd rather just stay where it's safe and where it's comfortable. So that's part of why there's a therapist shortage, is because most people who are looking for therapists are looking for therapists in private practice.
In the private setting.
Right.
Yeah.
It's
a struggle for sure. Yeah, actually myself, I'm in a college setting, and then I'm opening up a telehealth private practice on the side to reach more people, because it's very disheartening if someone has depression, they can barely get out of bed, and then they can't find somebody that they resonate with or with availability to see for their own services, which would have been private practice. So there's ways that some of us were trying to expand and reach more people, but it's tough.
Yeah. How can people approach dating and friendships with confidence? With the sassy princess era that's happening now.
Oh my God.
And yeah. So tell us.
I think that sometimes we forget to evaluate character.
Ooh.
And and I'm not saying that like I'm not saying the resume isn't important, right? Like it also says a lot about what they value. If somebody went to Harvard Medical School and is a doctor that makes a certain amount of money, and that's the kind of person that you want, it's not only an indicator of what you value, it's also an indicator of like this person, what he values too, right? Like he values a good education, he values a good stable job, a high paying salary, he values a certain lifestyle. I'm not saying that those things aren't important. I'm saying that those things aren't necessarily an indicator of somebody's character, because he could have gone to Harvard Medical School and he is an anesthesiologist who makes like $600K a year, but he could also be doing cocaine on the side.
Right.
And a very abusive person. And his parents don't know that he's abusive because they don't see it. His parents don't know that he does cocaine, but they want to set him up with you, the single eligible bachelorette, and your parents are like, oh my God, he's the
doctor.
One. The doctor. Like, they're not even thinking about like, is he a good person? Like, I think that when it comes to relationships, not just romantic relationships, but just relationships in general, it's not about being a master of one trade. It's about being a jack of all trades. You don't have to be like you don't have to have the perfect body. You don't have to have the perfect job. You don't have to have the perfect salary. You don't have to have the perfect looks. You don't have to have the perfect lifestyle. but you do have to have a little bit of an education. You do at the very least have to have a college degree. You don't have to be like a doctor, but you have to have a stable job with a stable salary too. Like you don't have to have a six pack abs, but you do at least have to, like, take care of your health and your wellness at some point. You don't have to be, Mr. Good looking, but you do have to be a little bit attractive to somebody, not everybody, but at least to somebody. I think so much we forget that when people ask for standards, when people ask for certain expectations, they're not asking for you to be perfect. They're just asking for, like, hey, this is just a preference that works for me. And that's not set in stone either. I think that sometimes people, they get defensive when they hear other people's expectations. And we shouldn't get defensive, but rather just understand that people are looking for somebody who is a jack of all trades, not a master of all trades, it's just a jack of all trades, just somebody who is well rounded. And I think that we should all look for well rounded people in our life, not just when it comes to romantic relationships, but just in our friendships too, because when we are well rounded and we look for well rounded people, we are really looking for somebody's character, not necessarily what they have, but how they respond to the things that they do and the things that they have. Their why. What's their why? What's their reasoning? Why do they value, looks or dressing nice, right? And if they do value those things, are they your person? Because I will tell you, there's a trend in the South Asian community that is really starting to bother me a little bit. It's like we are calling these very superficial things red flags or green flags. And I'm like, those are not necessarily indicative of somebody's character. Okay. He does, like, just because you're like some like really dumb shit.
Give
Like,
us an example.
like
What is the red and green flags?
like I'm trying to think because there's so many.
Okay.
And it's just like
Take your time.
yeah, it's insane. It's like if he it just things that aren't even necessarily indicators of a person's character. Like if he has too many female friends, that's a red flag. Or like if she has like a high body count, that's a red flag. I'm like, none of these things are an assessment of somebody's character, right? Somebody can have a ton of female friends, and that could actually mean that they understand women a lot more because they're constantly surrounded by women. They have platonic friendships with women, so they understand women as human beings. And just because a woman has a quote unquote high body count, like, that does not mean that she sleeps around with everyone. That just happens to be her life experience. And also, if that's what you value in a human being, that says a lot about you. Why is that important to you? Why is that something that you look for in a long-term life partner? And I say this with love. If the person next to you, whether it's like a friend or your husband, if that's somebody who's going to irritate the crap out of you when you're 80 years old and retired, they're not the one.
Right.
They're not the one. I'm sorry, but they're not the one. Like, if you genuinely, the person in front of you, if you cannot picture yourself living a retired life with them, they're not the one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. And it also reminded me of the lists that have been going around and trending on all social media of places a man shouldn't take us on a first date, and the number one is Cheesecake Factory. I love Cheesecake Factory, and it's actually expensive.
Yeah, I would kill for pasta from Cheesecake Factory. I'm someone who I like to get to know like more like small business owned restaurants because it's New York. Like,
right, of course.
If it's just like a random night and we have nothing planned and we're like, want to go to the Cheesecake Factory. And I think people forget that it's not about where you are, it's who you're with. Like, I think sometimes we associate like Cheesecake Factory, that might mean that he's a cheap person. Okay, that's possibly true, or that he doesn't have taste. Okay, that's possibly true. Okay, that might be true. Okay, but you're not going to know that until you get
You
there,
go.
right?
Yeah.
And you know, I think it also depends on how well you already know that person, right? Maybe you wouldn't go to the Cheesecake Factory with a complete stranger that you haven't met in person yet. But if you are in a relationship with somebody for like a year and they're like, "Oh, you want to go to the Cheesecake Factory?" Okay, like I think that people put way too many expectations on the first date. And that first date, it's like you don't know this person. You are getting to know this person. They are getting to know you. You guys don't even know if you want the same things yet. Like for all you know, you get there and he is a dull dud and you're probably even more of a dull dud. So like just just meet somebody and get to know who they are first, and then maybe later down the line you guys go to a nice restaurant or you guys go to the Cheesecake Factory. Like I just feel like we're so wrapped up in these very like superficial things that aren't necessarily indicators of somebody's character, and that's fucked up part.
Absolutely. And character, it's so big. Not prioritizing, rude to the server or just people in general, thought they were better than others, misogynistic, and would do things such as judge a woman's body count. Meanwhile, theirs is off the charts. So it's like clearly some of this stuff is also self-hate and they need to go get work done on themselves. But character, because character barely ever changes. And that's something we all have to remember in friendships and dating. Both your friendships and dating, if they have poor character, that's probably not going to last, and it will probably blow up in your face. Some friendship breakups can be ugly.
Because it's all because of, and I say this with love to any Indian American women who's listening to this. I say this with love. Most of your friends are trash. Like I'm dead serious. Because I feel like this goes back to the perfect Indian girl thing. Perfect Indian girl syndrome essentially means that Indian American women, we hold each other to these very unrealistic perfectionist standards. And then we talk about each other behind each other's back. Like those are not real friends. They're superficial as, and I will say this, I think the reason why like we have these like women who have these very superficial expectations in men, that's because we place a lot of superficial expectations on them. Like women who are so perfect in every way, they have superficial expectations in men because they are expected to uphold those superficial expectations as well. Their mindset is, well, if I have to be a size 0, and if I have to watch what I eat, and if I have to do this, that, and the third, then why can't he? If I'm putting effort, then why can't he put effort into the way that he looks? And it's like, honey, the first step is to unlearn the fact that you've been held to these very unrealistic standards. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have like similar standards or expectations in men, but that maybe you're putting harsh expectations on other people because you've had harsh expectations on yourself. And of course, there's something to be said about like men who literally like don't do jack shit but want women to do everything.
Right.
Like, you get the energy that you put out. Your energy has to match, and if you're not willing to put forth the energy that you would want from somebody else, they're not going to want that. You attract the energy you put out.
So true. I feel like I have this theory, but please correct me if I'm wrong because you all are therapists here. But I feel like if someone is not your type, then you wouldn't sustain with them. Now, hear me out. Because like, okay, if you're with someone who is not your type, right? Because he loves you a lot, he does a lot of things for you. But then in the end, you would still look at other places. Now with social media, we have Instagram but there's so many other apps. Can't think about it right now. The brain's not braining. But, if someone's not your type, when you're with him, you would still look for someone else. Yeah, the fine type.
No, define. No, I said define type.
Type. Like, I mean, for example, the girl wants someone with who is emotionally intelligent. I'm talking about character now. Emotionally intelligent, probably maybe some, yeah, like he has to be kind, he has to he has to have that hustle mindset.
Mhm.
So like for you to be with someone who is not like that, also maybe like if she likes to dress up and he's not like that. So
Then why is she with him?
because as women we are taught that you should be with someone who loves you a lot. So she's like, okay, I'll give him a chance. Because
Mm.
I know so many people like that. Don't worry, I'm single, so it's not my story. but this is my theory. Like, shouldn't be with someone who's not your type, because then you would still look for your type behind. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
for example, many men out there, they're with someone who's not their type. For
Mm.
example, the guy, he has six packs and all that, and he would want someone who goes to the gym as well. But now he's with a girl who, loves her curves and all that. So probably behind her back, he's talking to other girls. That's my theory. What do you think? Should you only settle for your type?
So I have a complicated answer to this, is that um one, people are always looking for things that they can't have, and people are always looking for the next best thing, especially in large cities like, I'm sure Kuala Lumpur in is I'm sorry, I am not geographically versed. Is that the city?
No, but for you to know my city, that's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. I am not well geographically versed, but I'm imagining that's a big city, and in big
Yep.
cities like New York as well. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we're always looking for the next best thing. And while I do think that there's no such thing as having a type, I do think that when we talk about having a type, we're talking about the physical attributes of what we're attracted to. And I think that sometimes we associate somebody's physical looks for their values, or somebody's physical looks for their character. And I think that if we pursue somebody that's not our physical type, we have a tendency to assume, oh, well, they'll want to be with me. They'll stick around with me. They'll never abandon me because I am the person that's more physically desirable than them. They'll never leave me because they're not physically attractive. I am the more physically attractive person here.
I
And
guess
yeah,
type is not the right word then. Probably standards,
okay.
to be with someone of who has not ticked all the list. I'm so sorry.
But I still,
you know,
but that's why I said define type. And
Yeah.
but
so
some
maybe
people
type is not the
that's,
right
but
definition.
it's a good question though. And I think
Yeah.
Tracy was onto something there, because a lot of people are like that. They refuse to date outside of their physical type.
Right.
And
Mm-hmm. I think
Yeah.
that, if you're with somebody that you aren't actually attracted to, but then you're like on Hinge or Bumble or some dating app, Tinder on the side, scrolling through other girls or other boys, then you also have to really ask yourself the reason why you're with this person. What function does this serve? If you know this person is not your type, but they love you more than anyone ever would, and you're with them, but you're secretly looking at other people, what function does that serve to be with that person? What are you running away from? And if you're with somebody because they love you, but you're actually looking at all these other people, the reality is A, you're afraid of being alone, and B, you know that the people that you're looking at would never love you the way that you want to be loved. And I think that's also a terrible assumption too. Just because somebody is physically your type, or just because somebody meets your standards, does not mean that they're incapable of loving you. I think that we have a tendency to think, oh, your type means they're X. That's not necessarily true. Your type is your type. And sometimes people who fall into your type, they could be an or they could be a, and then sometimes people who fall into your type, they could actually give you the love that you think you deserve. Like, somebody's ability or inability to meet your type does not necessarily dictate the kind of character they are. They could be your type and have a good character, or they could be your type and have a poor character. Somebody who is not your type does not mean that they have good character or that they're the right person for you. If that does that make sense?
Oh my gosh, it makes so much sense. So
I
much
was thinking if my question makes sense just now. So
sense.
I'm glad that like I that kind of cleared some things up. I think that for whoever is like in a relationship with somebody who loves them and is like secretly veering off, like you have to really ask yourself, like, what purpose does it serve to stay in that relationship? I'm out.
Yeah, and that's happened to me before where a guy was messaging others behind my back and definitely more, 100% more than that. And you think, why are they keeping someone on the back burner? I mean, at the end of the day, so if you're on that side where somebody is doing that behind your back, remember that it's really not you. It's a
it's
them
them.
issue.
The
Like,
mission.
they have a lot going on there, and probably a lot of self-hate stuff and just never being enough and always needing to have backup plans. And it's really more of them and not you. And you deserve someone of a higher character who wouldn't do that, who would actually know what's in front of them and keep it instead of have one foot out the door. Because that's what I believe a lot of that can be, is someone will be in a relationship with a person who they think, oh my gosh, they could leave me at any point in time, because they probably have low self-esteem, of course. So then they're looking and cheating or whatever, just in case. They'll never be alone. And it's that same thing that Tracy just said of, why are you afraid to be alone? You know? And that's something that needs to be resolved through journaling and therapy and whatnot. And then the other part of that, Hersyn, that you were saying, the character stuff, I believe that searching for character is actually a good thing. So
what I meant was actually searching for character, not type.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
Like, yeah.
You need to search for character. That's yeah.
I think, I mean, regardless of what you're searching for, I think that dynamic of like, I'm in a relationship with somebody and I'm still looking at all my options. To me, it's just, in general, that's just an indicator that the person you're with, you're not supposed to be with them for whatever reason.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how good of a person they are, you are not supposed to be with them. And if you're watching this and you are with somebody who you know is cheating on you and talking to other people, I want you to know, just like Aubrey said, it's not about you. They are afraid of losing you. They're afraid of sunken costs, lost opportunity. And it definitely is coming from a scarcity mindset. I have to hoard all my resources and all my options because I might lose them, right? That's why they're keeping you around. It's them, it's not you.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, those are all of our questions. And Tracy, we really appreciate it. You just killed it. And this is going to help a lot of people who come across this on YouTube or in the podcast app. So we really appreciate you so much. I definitely want to send referrals your way in the future.
Yeah.
Really awesome, and showed us what a therapist should be, you know, because in a world where people are afraid to dive in, you're really showing them, oh, look, you can have a empathic space where you can be yourself, talk about the racism and the pressures. So I think this was a really special interview. So really appreciate it so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You're a wonderful human being. So thank you for being here.
Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate being on this podcast. This was a lovely conversation. And yeah, I look forward to seeing it on YouTube, on Instagram. There's so many lovely tidbits from today that I just want people to hear.
Absolutely.
If you want to follow Tracy and know more about her, you can follow her on Instagram and TikTok at The Bad Indian Therapist.
And remember, she's also open to seeing clients in
And you get a
York.
free intro call. So
Yeah, absolutely. And what did she say? New York, Florida, and California?
you got that right.
All right. So if you're looking for a therapist, hit up Tracy.
She's your girl.
Time for affirmations. And to go with what we've been sharing today, if you're struggling with either a friendship breakup or a romantic relationship breakup, I want you to take a moment and just take the pressure off of yourself. You might be sitting in a place of self-blame, self-doubt, really calling yourself bad names and seeing yourself as less than. But actually, you are a beautiful person who will find the friends or the friend or the partner that suits you best. It's coming as long as you keep putting yourself out there and making efforts. That just wasn't the right fit. And that's all it means. It doesn't mean you're a terrible person. It doesn't mean you're a list of all these bad things that run into your head at night. Just keep doing the work and you'll find that one day. But you're also going to find peace and self-love and self-esteem and self-confidence, which will put you in an even better place moving forward to find a friend that matches you in that way, or the partner. So I don't want you to be hard on yourself, and give yourself a minute to just not be hard on yourself today. And as always, we love you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. Please make sure to follow us on Instagram at Girl Chat International. That's Girl Chat INTL on Instagram. If you want to follow some of Hersyn's content, follow Daisy Girls on a Roll, and follow Aubrey's content on truthfully.yours.blog. See you all soon on our next episode.